All right, now the very last thing we want to take a look at this chapter is the long-lasting impact of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Yesterday we took a look at the creative nature of the New Deal programs. Yesterday we took a look at how those programs were designed to solve multiple different problems. And so how these programs were incredibly creative. They were creative, they were priming the pump in a way that Americans had never seen done before. And so, for example, real quick review, we talked about what pump priming is. Pump priming is when the government injects the economy with money to try to keep the economy going. Donald Trump has primed the pump by giving us $1,200 stimulus checks. FDR primed the pump by creating programs that use government money to fund projects that needed done. So, for example, we talked about the PWA creating government programs for things like the Shenango Dam and the Rec Center. We talked about yesterday how the government funded programs like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and how they took young men ages 18 to 25, shipped them all over the country, once again providing services that different regions of the country needed done. Those young men were pulled out of the workforce so that they didn't compete with the older men who needed work in their area. And then most of the money that they were being paid was sent back home to support their families. We talk about how that program solved 3 or 4 different problems. One of the most successful programs of the New Deal was also the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they bought farms from struggling poor farmers in the Tennessee River Valley. They flooded out and destroyed those farms, but replaced them with dams. And those dams created, the construction of the dams created jobs for the farmers. When the dam was constructed and finished, the farming land that was left in that valley was considerably better because of the irrigation programs and the reduction in flooding. And then those farmers who lost their land now got jobs working in the hydroelectric plants. And those hydroelectric plants provided cheap government subsidized electricity to the region to improve the quality of life for everybody. These are the types of programs of the New Deal that were creative ways to prime the pump and get the American economy through the Depression. And this is the type of creative stuff that the American people loved about Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. The last thing we want to take a look at here is the long-lasting impact of the New Deal. What are some of the things that they did that to this day have changed the way that the Americans view their government? For example, we took a look at those programs yesterday, but you don't have the CCC today. The government's not going to, unless we develop new programs like this moving forward to address our current situation, you're probably not going to see the CCC giving you a job building, dams in other parts of the country or planting trees out in Oklahoma. However, what we have seen as a long-lasting impact is some of the ways that they addressed the Great Depression. The Wagner Act, under the New Deal, was the first piece of legislation that made it illegal for a factory to fire someone for supporting a union. In the early parts of the industrialized era of the United States, unions were viewed as dangerous. Big businesses controlled all of the labor rights of the people that worked for them. For example, in the last couple chapters, we talked about alcoholism being a problem in the United States because the conditions in factories were dangerous. The hours were long, the pay was not that great, and people were stressed out. Anytime they tried to unionize to work for workers' rights, unions were shot down. And usually the government came down on the side of businesses. FDR was the first president to actively support unions, to actively support workers' rights and rights to strike in various different ways that they could get their needs met. The Wagner Act was the first piece of legislation that he was able to ram through Congress with his New Deal and his programs and his popularity to get first workers' rights. But perhaps nothing done during the Great Depression and through the New Deal had a longer lasting impact on America than the Social Security Act. This is a big piece of legislation that to this day revolutionizes the way Americans view retirement. Now, you have to understand what the Social Security was supposed to do. All right? At At the time, the objective was to encourage people to retire so that it would create jobs for younger people who needed to support their families. And so the objective behind the Social Security Act was to try to find a way that the government could subsidize people's retirement, encourage more people to retire so that they could create jobs for younger people. Now, when the Social Security Act was first put into place, it was not designed to be your entire retirement. It was only designed to supplement the retirement you had already saved for. The objective behind the Social Security Act was that they were going to create a new tax that the American people were going to pay. And that money was going to be set aside so that when you went to retire, when you hit the age of 65, you retired, you left the workforce, and the government would start sending you supplemental checks to keep you paying your bills, to keep you capable of doing the things that you were comfortable doing, but creating a job for somebody else. Now, you have to understand how this would be very controversial at the time. At a time whenever the American people were losing their jobs and they were struggling, Franklin Roosevelt was suggesting taxing them even more. The Social Security tax is not part of your income tax. It's a separate tax that you pay that supplements these programs. So you have to understand the degree of difficulty it would be for Roosevelt to convince the Congress and the American people to do something like this. Passing the Social Security Act is a crowning achievement of how successful Franklin Roosevelt was at being able to sell his ideas to the American people. And as controversial as it was at the time, it worked. The Social Security Act was able to solidify. It funded a lot of unemployment programs. The Social Security Act funded single mothers and poor children in orphanages and helped people get through there. And after people reached the age of 65, they could reasonably retire with supplements from the Social Security Act. Now, here's the thing. To this day, the Social Security Act is a major part of the American retirement system, but it is currently today going bankrupt. Social Security, as it was designed at the time, should never have gone bankrupt. The way that Franklin Roosevelt designed it, Social Security was set up so that people would pay into it. At that time, people were mostly blue-collar laborers working in factories from the time they were 18, 20 years old until they were 65. The way that Franklin Roosevelt had the Social Security system designed, the average American would have paid into the system for 40 to 45 years at a time when the average life expectancy was 72 years and they would retire at 65. So if you do the quick math, you have generations of Americans who paid into Social Security over the course of 45 years and then usually only collected out of it for 7. Social Security should have so much money in it that it should never go bankrupt. The reason it's going bankrupt today is for generations, Congress has dipped into that Social Security fund to fund other programs. And just in the last 10 years, we've started to realize that the Social Security program had become depleted in a way that it should have never gotten depleted. And this is a huge problem that Congress and the President are dealing with today. How do we fix or at least try to maybe replace and find some way to replenish the Social Security program? This is a huge hot button issue that to this day affects the American people. Now, here's the thing. You have to understand, not every idea of the New Deal was golden. Some of them were incredibly controversial, and some of these programs were struck down by Congress. Here's a good example. The NIRA. The National Industrial Recovery Act was established the first minimum wages, the first 40-hour work week, and it allowed the government to set prices for goods. Now, when you take a look at this, this is not a bad idea. The Brain Trust was onto something here. To this day, we have minimum wages. To this day, the standard work week in the United States is a 40-hour work week. These are all things that we have today. But take a look at the government was allowed to set prices in various markets to regulate those markets and keep the United States going. Well, let me ask you a question. What type of government tells companies how much they can pay their workers? What type of a government tells companies how many hours their workers are going to work? And what type of government tells companies how much they can charge for the goods that they come up with? The answer is socialist communist countries. And so when they first came up with the NIRA, while today many of the elements of the NIRA are standard practices in the American workforce, at the time it was viewed as communist, and the Supreme Court struck it down. Another example, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. During the Great Depression, they actually paid farmers to destroy their crops. And one of the great ironies of the Great Depression is that while people were starving to death, farmers out in the frontiers and out in the West were actually destroying crops, killing livestock, and leaving them to rot because they weren't worth anything. In many cases, the markets were so low that it cost you more money to raise a farm animal, it cost you more money to raise a crop than you could sell them for. And so many farmers were losing their shirt, so to speak. So to regulate the markets, now some people think that this seems misguided. They say, well, why couldn't the government just buy up that stuff and spread it out to people and feed the homeless, feed the people who were starving? That would have helped the people at that time. But it wouldn't have helped markets, it wouldn't have helped farmers, and it wouldn't have helped the economy in the long run. So Franklin Roosevelt's solution was the government paid farmers not to grow certain crops. The government paid farmers to destroy some of their animals and some of their livestock. Why? So that they could get the markets regulated, so that the markets would be where they needed to be, and moving forward, the markets would eventually recover for the long haul. The thought process was, it may seem cruel at the time while people are starving to destroy some of this stuff, but in the end, it's going to help. Now, let me ask you a question. What type of a government tells farmers how many crops they can grow, how many animals they can have? What type of a government seizes control of those markets and tells exactly what the market price is going to be? The answer, communist markets, communist governments. And so this is why some of these ideas were struck down by the Supreme Court. In the end, Franklin Roosevelt became frustrated after a while because even though he'd had wild success with his New Deal programs, and even though he'd had wild success with his fireside chats, garnering support from the American people, he became upset with the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court was striking down his plans. And so when Franklin Roosevelt got angry with the Supreme Court, he suggested an amendment that would fundamentally change the Supreme Court moving forward. Now, this is where Franklin Roosevelt went a bit too far. If you look at the structure of the American government, the Congress's job is to create laws, the president's job is to carry out those laws, and the Supreme Court's job is to determine whether or not the other two branches are doing things constitutionally. And these cases, the Supreme Court had determined that the NIRA and the AAA, the president and Congress, were doing things that were unconstitutional. The government could not regulate markets, tell companies how often people could work, and regulate their pay. Now, FDR claimed that the Supreme Court was not striking down these plans because they were unconstitutional. FDR claimed that most of these Supreme Court justices, keep in mind, for the last 60 years had all been appointed by Republican presidents, which means most of those Supreme Court justices happened to favor the Republican Party. So FDR's argument is that the Supreme Court was not striking down his laws because they were unconstitutional. He felt they were striking them down because they were mostly Republican-leaning Supreme Court justices who were voting against a Democratic president. So his solution to the problem, let's pass an amendment to the Constitution that would allow the president to appoint a new justice to coincide with every justice over 70 years of age. Roosevelt said the Supreme Court justices are old men who have old, outdated ideas that are not good for this time and the extraordinary circumstances we're dealing with. He claimed he wanted to inject the Supreme Court with young blood, with fresh new ideas that were open to his New Deal programs. Now, at the time, of the 9 Supreme Court justices in the Supreme Court, 6 of them were over 70 years old. So if you do the math and you take a look at this, if his plan had passed, Franklin Roosevelt would have been able to pack the Supreme Court with 15 judges most of whom agreed with him in his New Deal policies. And if he had control of most of Congress, he had the support of the American people, and he had most of the Supreme Court in his back pocket, this would have made Franklin Roosevelt the closest thing we've ever had in American history to a dictator. And this is why the United States, the people of the United States in Congress saw that Franklin Roosevelt was becoming a little too powerful. And it's the closest thing in American history. He's the only president in U.S. history to serve more than 2 terms. He served 3 full terms. He was elected to a 4th term. He had been able to pass an extraordinary amount of government legislation. He had pushed the United States economy in the bounds of government to the brink, and now he wanted to change the Supreme Court. And this is why many Americans started to lose favor with FDR. And if he had survived and had kept on going, he probably wouldn't have won another term. He probably wouldn't have had nearly the support that he initially had, except for right around the time that this happened, World War II started. And so it's World War II that keeps Franklin Roosevelt in office for that many terms.